In the mid-19th century, Charles Darwin published his seminal work on the origin of species. Now, he wasn't the first to put forward an evolutionary story in biology, but he became the most successful. In this podcast, I will explain Darwin's idea, and I'll argue that contrary to the assumptions of the general public today, Darwinism struggles to account for life on our planet. Most people assume evolution to be a scientific law. Evolutionary biologist Doug Fukuyama says, the reason that natural selection is important is that it's the central idea that explains design in nature. In another podcast, I argued that biological complexity is evidence for the workings of a designing mind. Now, Darwin's idea attempts to cut to the root of this argument. He tries to account for the purposeful arrangement of biological parts without God. Kind of. He says this, I believe that animals have descended from at most only 4 or 5 progenitors, and plants from an equal or lesser number. Where did those progenitors come from? Well, Darwin does not really say. Maybe he leaves the door open a crack for God. Or maybe not. Either way, what he does say is that countless generations of species have emerged through natural processes alone. These elaborately constructed forms, so different and dependent on each other, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Professor of Biological Science Michael Behe suggests many of Darwin's ideas are helpful and probably true, yet Darwin has other ideas that are probably false. Darwin's problem is he's extended the true ideas way beyond the natural evidence. In the remainder of this podcast, I'm going to describe Darwin's main ideas, and then I'm going to give 2 reasons why the theory of evolution struggles to account for our planet's biological life. Here's Darwin's first big idea: common descent. This says that living organisms can be traced back in an evolutionary tree of life to different organisms from the past, where we might find commonality in features. Now, this idea is really interesting, but it's not really very helpful for 2 reasons. First, it does not say where those earlier animals actually came from. Second, it does not clearly explain how one species of animal might have gradually changed into a different species that's alive today. Maybe there is a biological relationship between certain species, and maybe there's not. Similarity might just be similarity of design, not the result of gradual change. Darwin's second idea is natural selection. An organism that changes to become better suited to its environment will survive better than those organisms that are less suited to this environment. Now, this statement is obviously true, but it does not explain why we have species in the first place. For example, it might explain why we have certain species and colours of butterflies in a particular region, but it doesn't explain why we have butterflies to begin with. Here's his third idea: random mutations. Now, this is where the philosophical, scientific, and theological importance of Darwin's theory lies. He claims that random variation in combination with natural selection can produce very complex biological systems. There are at least 3 problems here. Number 1, the vast majority of random mutations that have a measurable effect on life are harmful, not beneficial. They lead to the death or degrading of an organism, not the formation of a new one. Number 2, biology is complex. Behe has spent his career pointing to highly complex biological molecular systems and machines. These have remained out of reach of a genuine Darwinian explanation. And number 3, life has adaptive capabilities. Let's talk about the complexity problem. Have you ever experienced a paper cut? Ow! You know, the blood clotting mechanism that our body relies on in that situation is highly complex. So much so, a convincing causal Darwinian explanation for why our bodies have a blood clotting mechanism does not exist. Although evolutionary stories have been suggested, they are metaphorical rather than a truly scientific process. The clotting cascade is a breathtaking balancing act in which a menagerie of biochemicals bounce off one another at precise angles in a meticulously ordered sequence. And faced with such complexity beneath even simple phenomena, Darwinian theory falls silent. Another example of complexity is molecular machines like the bacterial flagellum, the propulsion mechanism for microorganisms. Behe says these are also beyond Darwinism. Multiple parts must be present and coexist for the bacterial flagellum to function. They cannot be cobbled together in a chance and incremental arrangement of parts. Even though we are told that all biology must be seen through the lens of evolution, no scientist has ever published a model to account for the gradual evolution of this extraordinary molecular machine. Further, new scientific discoveries are being made that make Darwinism harder to accept. For example, the bacteriophage T4 is a double-stranded DNA virus. It has been studied for years, and scientists have discovered it delivers its viral payload to cells by landing on them and injecting DNA into them. Recently, electron microscopy has allowed the study of the virus baseplate. Scientists have watched what happens when the virus opens its legs, lands on the cell, inserts its syringe, and deploys the DNA payload into it. They are watching the activity of tiny machines. The landing mechanism seems like a microscopic version of the Apollo Lunar Excursion Module, the LEM, that allowed humans to explore the moon in the late 1960s. Yet the bacteriophage T4 virus is very ancient, predating human technology. It's thought to date back billions of years to the earliest life. You know, as we study this ancient virus, we find a purposeful arrangement of parts in the apparatus to get viral DNA inserted into biological cells. Here's another example of complexity. This grasshopper was known to feature bumps on its hind quarters. Yet recently, the electron microscope has allowed scientists to discover what the bumps actually are. They look like and function like mechanical gears. Again, we see evidence here of a purposeful arrangement of parts. Evolutionary explanations for these and many other complex examples elude today's scientists. Now, bear in mind, many of them are highly motivated to disprove the idea of biology as the result of divine design, yet we're still waiting for the scientific evidence for the evolution of these and many other biological mechanisms. Alongside biological complexity, we also see life's ability to adapt. Behe has noticed this adaption's not like Darwin's idea. Life isn't forming new features by random processes and natural selection. Contemporary DNA sequencing shows us that instead, life sometimes loses features to better adapt to its environment. Life doesn't evolve. It does the reverse. It devolves. Certain people become resistant to the disease malaria. How does this happen? Well, a tiny break occurs sometimes in the sickle cell gene. This change inhibits the growth of the malaria microbe in the red blood cells of the patient, stopping them from contracting malaria. When genes and control regions break, positive results occur. But this is devolution. Parts of the system are turning off. This is not Darwinian evolution. Evolution seems unable to account for staggering biological complexity, like the blood clotting mechanism, and it doesn't fit with life's ability to adapt and turn off functions to achieve positive results. But how widely is this Darwinian problem recognised by scientists today? I'll come to that question in a moment. Let's pause. Here's a thought for this podcast. Evolution says only the strong survive. Those who adapt to the environment and beat the competition can live. The weak, well, they're crushed and beaten and replaced by the strong. Yet consider this. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 12, quotes a prophetic passage from the Old Testament, Isaiah 42 to be precise. And this passage looks ahead to the Messiah, Jesus. It describes him like this: He will not shout, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on the earth. These verses are physically located in the middle of the Bible, and I think they reflect the central heart of Jesus. He shows both love and justice. He is tender to the weak. When we decide to believe in Christ and align ourselves with him, we no longer have to worry about the times when we feel weak. God sees us, and in his compassion, he protects his children at this time. But God is also just. Evolution says you live, you die, and only the strong are remembered. Yet Jesus says, if I am the one leading your life, you can trust that I'm protecting you always. Don't worry about the outcome right now. My just plans will prevail. You know, things might be tough right now, but Jesus says to me, I see where you are, and I am here for you. It really will be all right in the end. It's November 2016, and a landmark meeting of the prestigious Scientific Royal Society is underway. Some of the attendees are concerned. What's their problem? The future of Darwinian evolution. Many say it is a theory in trouble. That's why this meeting's been called. Gerd Müller, Professor Emeritus at the University of Vienna, opens the meeting and expresses the problem eloquently. The synthesis theory, evolution, is a theory that is focused on variations in populations. That's its core. It explains to some extent the gradual variation of phenotypic characters. This means traits in a species like height or eye colour, etc. He goes on. However, what it does not explain is the origin of these body plans, and also complex behaviours and complex physiological development. The standard theory, evolution, is focused on characters that exist already and their variation and maintenance across populations, but not on how they originate. Now, if you think about it, this is staggering. Dr. Müller is saying this: Darwin's theory about the origin of species doesn't do what he claimed that it did all of those years ago. It doesn't account for the origin of species. Müller thinks evolution might sometimes explain variation between pre-existing species to some extent, but it does not explain how species came to be here to begin with. So where does life come from then? Some evolutionary ideas may have a bearing on biology, but the Darwinian ideas of common descent, natural selection and random mutation can't result in the purposeful arrangement of parts that we see with increasing clarity today. From blood clotting to jumping grasshoppers to devolution, the more complex these systems are found to be, the more profound the arrangement of the parts becomes. And the bigger the problem for Darwin. When it comes to origins, it seems that science is actually pointing to the evidence of the work of a designer. This podcast is based on the lecture Relentless Science, Fathomless Design, given by Dr. Michael Behe to the Christian Scientific Society on 15th November 2021.